Hello, welcome to another virtual program from Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman, and it's October 7th, 2024. And this is our book talk on the book Traveling with Ann Powers. Before we go any further, I just want to take a moment to remember that Maine Historical Society recognizes that what is currently referred to as Maine is Wabanaki homelands, a place the Wabanaki people have stewarded for over 13,000 years. And wherever we are in Maine, we are on Wabanaki homelands. We recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations within these lands and waters. Understanding Wabanaki history is vital to understanding Maine, and we are committed to helping provide education about this history through partnerships with Wabanaki people. In fact, our exhibit, Music in Maine, is a good example of one of those partnerships. And tonight's talk is part of our series on music in Maine. If you haven't had a chance to see our exhibit yet, please do so soon. It's going to be open through the end of the year, through December 31st. You can also see it online. So if you're interested in the online version or in buying tickets, just visit mainehistory.org and you'll find all the information that you need. Joining us tonight is Ann Powers, who's here to talk about her new book, Traveling on the Path of Joni Mitchell. And I was inspired to ask Ann to join us for this when I learned that one of Joni Mitchell's records was actually inspired by a cross-country road trip that she made to and from Damariscotta. And Anne is here. She has been a music critic for more than 30 years, working for NPR, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Times and other publications. And in the decade that she's worked with NPR, she's written extensively on music and culture and appeared regularly on the All Songs Considered podcast and on news shows, including All Things Considered and Morning Edition. Her other books include a memoir, Weird Like Us, My Bohemian America, Good Booty, Love and Sex, Black and White, Body and Soul in American Music, and Piece by Piece with Tori Amos. She lives in Nashville, and thank you so much, Anne, for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much. Hi, do I sound okay?
You do, you sound great.
Great. Thanks so much to those who are here, an intimate group, and I appreciate that. I hope you all engage in conversation. That's more fun than just talking at you. So we'll definitely leave some good time for questions. So I also am traveling at the moment. I'm on the road. I'm actually promoting a new book that I'm part of called How Women Made Music, A Revolutionary History. It's the first book from NPR Music, my employer, and it comes from our Turning the Table series, which seeks to center marginalized, underrepresented, and overlooked voices, especially those of women in music history. So I'm here in DC because we're doing an event tomorrow night at the Corcoran. So that's why it looks so nice in here. This hotel is much nicer than my house. So I thought, and to wit, I realized as I was traveling, I've been to New York, Boston, and DC all in the last like 8 days or 10 days, but I didn't bring a copy of my book. So beautiful technology. I do have a Kindle. It's not syncing up. So I'm reading from my phone, which I think is very apt for the theme of mobility and adjustment to the modern. I
Absolutely.
mean, I just want to say that uh, one major theme in this book. So this book it is a biography, but it's like a little different than a regular biography. It is a work of cultural criticism, memoir, contextualization, and it moves linearly through Joni Mitchell's life, but always taking kind of side roads and exploring kind of sometimes underexplored areas of her story and trying to connect her with the larger story of people in the post-war era in from the 60s onward when she became famous, and particularly around the theme of mobility, and particularly for women because of course after World War II, women became much more mobile in the U.S., middle-class women, but all women really, and not only the U.S., Canada, obviously. Joni's from Canadian, so from Saskatchewan. So this is obviously the title of the book is from her song "All I Want" from her great album Blue. I am on a lonely road and I'm traveling, 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 traveling. And I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs first from just two paragraphs from, or a couple paragraphs from the introduction, just to set up this idea of traveling as a theme throughout the book. I'm talking here about uh, how I didn't want to write a conventional biography, and how the theme presented it's the idea of traveling and movement, and this being more kind of an atlas than a biography came to me rather obviously. It's not exactly an obscure metaphor. I mean, it's right there in her songs. So uh, here we go. In Mitchell, I found an inexhaustible subject, one who never let me put down my pen and declare my maps complete. As I tried to keep up, I had to embrace a new way of writing that made room for gaps, inconsistencies, and contradictions, honoring those unstable elements as essential to a story well told. I am on a lonely road, and I am traveling, 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 Mitchell sings in All I Want, the opening track on her most revered album, Blue. I love that lyric because of the word she repeats at its end. Every traveling is different, determined, anxious, liberated, driven. As Joni extends her breath and clips it, finding a rhythm and immediately pushing away its constraints. So much ground covered in so little time. The line perfectly describes my experience writing this book. As I immersed myself in the landscapes and soundscapes where Mitchell landed and made her music, I had to keep uprooting myself, rejecting any settled stances about who this woman is and why her music is so special. I needed to keep moving because that's what she's always done. What often happens to legends like Mitchell, not as people necessarily, but as subjects of the world's impassioned interest, is that they get stuck within the edifice of fame. In some ways, they become monuments themselves, solid structures built from the aspects of themselves that others love most. Joni Mitchell, the misunderstood musical genius, the emblematic free woman, the sad girl's or boy's best imaginary friend, has solidified into a series of qualities and traits rather than remaining a dynamic force running on both magic and flaws. She is open tunings, confessional songwriting, jazz rock. She is a gamine old crone, a childless mother, a true blue lover, leaving before the sun comes up. She is always in her own category, so relatable, ultimately unknowable. In truth, she's all of these things, but reducing her to any one of them turns her into stone. Mitchell's music chases and challenges society's assumptions about what a woman and an artist can be. Any singular view of her artistry and her influence diminishes it. I'm taking Mitchell's lead on this. I feel like sometimes I'm a multi-phrenic person, she once said, apparently inventing a term psychologists would later use to describe the condition of having many selves and self-representations that conflict. Mitchell put it more plainly. Will the real me stand up? You know? My goal has been to follow Joni Mitchell as she's drifted and flown and to chart the rhythms of her inquiries. Her self-conception begins in movement. When asked to define herself, she rarely calls herself a musician first, saying that since she was a child, she's been a dancer and a painter, shimmying with the boys and the bad girls in a Saskatoon dive, wrecking her stockings, reaching her arms overhead to make brushstrokes on a canvas, opening up unimagined vistas with a smear of paint. A portrait hardens and becomes lifeless when its maker loses track of its breath, the living presence of her subject, a constantly shifting thing, blurry, then focused, then dissolving, then clear, then different. The light has changed. and strives for something absolute. A map maker must be open to new routes. People are not definitive. Neither is any one story. That is the point of Joni Mitchell's songs. Life is stranger and bigger than that. And people, even geniuses, are smaller, human, always incomplete. Every legend is also one of us. So that sets up a little bit um, the sort of structure of the book. And now I have to get this Kindle to, okay, there we go. Okay, so now I'm going to take you. So that sets up the structure of the book. The first chapter is about Joni's childhood in Saskatchewan and other points Canadian, but also about the idea of childhood and how important that was to singer-songwriters of Joni's cohort and how often they wrote about their childhood in a certain way, kind of idealizing it. And for Joni, part of the idealization was also the yearning, the longing to go, the urge for going, as she said in a song. So out of that childhood, she does become a traveler. She first goes to art school in Calgary, Alberta, and then she moves on. She goes to the Mariposa Folk Festival. She's a huge fan of Buffy St. Marie, and she goes there to see Buffy and ends up eventually settling in Toronto, marries Chuck Mitchell, who she becomes pregnant actually by from her college boyfriend, Brad McMath, marries Chuck Mitchell, who's a folk singer, but gives up her child and trusts her child in adoption. Eventually leaves Mitchell not too long after the marriage began. Ends up in New York, hangs out with Leonard Cohen and Dave Van Ronk and Al Cooper and Judy Collins, lots of people. Starts to get known. Tom Rush, who is a neighbor of Maine's, of y'all's from New Hampshire, is the first to have a real hit with one of her songs. And Judy Collins does. She's getting known, things are happening. So this chapter, The Humming of the Wheels, tells a little bit of that story. I'm just going to read you the first part, just to give you an idea of Joni as a road dog. The very first song Joni Mitchell claims to have written, called Day After Day, is about leaving home, getting stuck, and desperately wanting to keep moving. She was 21 and unexpectedly pregnant, though it's unclear whether she knew that yet. The song, a blues, implies that she had her suspicions. One-way ticket to Toronto in her hand, she was headed to the Mariposa Folk Festival, her first big venture beyond the coffee houses of Calgary, where she'd begun to share her songs. The baby's father, her fellow art student Brad McMath, was sitting right there with her on the train, whose hum Joni picked up in her song, but his absence in the lyrics, except as a source of anxiety and longing. More recognizable, there is the influence of the Black artists, beloved by the young folkies whom she'd begun to call friends. Day after day, the song begins, miles and miles of railroad track. Night after night, humming of the wheels. The woman Joni imagines in that song, a version of herself, once rode the rails, but now sits alone in a room. A lover was supposed to follow her from a place whose markers are faded from her memory. Lie awake and dream of days of auld lang syne, moonlight through the pine. But like the reflected shimmer of night, he's fading. He doesn't show. Something is wrong confining her. Make $1, need it twice. Pray my darling comes before too late. Given its place on the path of Joni's life, this song can be counted as confessional. But as with all of Mitchell's songwriting, it veers from introspection to an engagement with something larger. In this case, her generation's propensity to drift and the risks of that for women in particular. In 1964, Joni had just started life as an explorer, but already she was dwelling on that itch to progress or escape, or both. And not only in the songs she wrote about the childhood she was leaving behind. The markers of her life at this point kept moving, and her songs captured that. Urge for going, born to take the highway, here today and gone tomorrow. That train across Canada, sometime in Calgary and Toronto, the sudden end of her affair with McMath. a quickie marriage that took her to Detroit. The end of that union and her decision to entrust the daughter she bore in adoption, leaving her to wonder for years where that child herself had flown. A deeper immersion in her music, leading to career cultivating side trips through the Midwest and New England, and eventual briefly landing in New York. Idols in London and South Florida. All of this happened before Joni Mitchell ever saw LA. From her teen years onward, Joni was propelled by a ruling tension between her need for grounding and solitude and her hankering for yet another port of call. I imagine her lugging a ukulele and soon after a guitar aboard the buses and trains of North America, or depositing her instrument carefully in the trunks of cars she shared with men named Eric, David, Patrick, Tom, all itinerant musicians like herself, or driving her own vehicle from an army base to a church hall, happy to settle in for a week's run in a downtown strip of folk dives when a booker would give her that break. From 1963 to 1967, even for the 2 years when she was married to Chuck Mitchell and living in Detroit, Mitchell was a vagabond. It suited her. It also made for a strong persona and great songs. Unlike some of her peers, she took each increasingly bigger step delicately, compelled to strive for a stable future as much as to live by the road's rules. Joni Mitchell in transition didn't simply fancy herself a free spirit. She worked to inhabit that archetype, though it sometimes contradicted her nature and the lessons of her upbringing, and in one central moment, her ability to care for another soul whose absent presence would stay with her from the moment she placed that baby in adoption in another family's care. Mitchell created herself through a determined kind of restlessness, presenting herself to her audiences and her friends as a makeshift homemaker who decorate her temporary lodgings with thrift store tapestries and crystals, but who was happy to throw all that in a box when it was time to try another town. At 22, she made a tape recording for her mother, a typically barbed-wired gift from a daughter looking in the rear view. Every one of its songs was about getting the hell away. I like this picture of the young Joni, breaking free despite the hard decisions she had to make to do so. I can hardly resist romanticizing her as a femme Kerouac on her own road, continually casting her eyes past the suitcase packed at the foot of her latest bed, not to mention the hunky folk singer in it, and toward the door. In her early 20s, Joni insistently became her own person by setting forth in ways women have risked throughout modern history, leaving the stifling small towns for the riskiness of the city, defying family expectations in hopes of encountering something, anything new. In the 1960s, such migrations became emblematic of women's liberation, chronicled in many novels, films, and songs, not just Joni's. That wave extended into my own lifetime. I, too, left behind my boring hometown at the turn of my 20s with the fire of ambition in my belly, landing in San Francisco with the same lack of clear plans, looking for people who would take my dares. She'd set out to conquer the coffee houses. I pursued poetry and a bit more avidly poets. I forgot to call my parents for 6 months at a time. I know what it's like to be young and feel like you absolutely have to get where things are happening. As I learned more about Joni's peregrinations, I thought about that compulsion and how it can seem like the center keeps shifting further away, like the bright burning heart of a fast-moving star. The thrill and terror of never having been more alone. One day I was climbing on the rocks at Ocean Beach near the ruins of San Francisco's Sutro Baths, and I got stuck halfway down a cliff hanging over the crashing water. If I fall, I thought, no one will know I was here and am gone. In the story of Joni's early journeys, I feel that energy, the need to be seen and heard, and to keep going, because standing still might spell oblivion. So that's my take on like the early Joni, the folk Joni, the Joni that many people don't really know about. Luckily for us now, as she's putting out her archival recordings, we have better documentation of this, and there's a wonderful early um, early set of demos and things like that that you can read from. And should I continue to read, or I see you've jumped on the screen,
No,
Kathleen?
you
Oh,
absolutely, you can
okay.
absolutely continue. Yeah, please.
Okay. Oh, okay, great. So yeah, so that's that period. And then of course she moves to Los Angeles. An interesting thing I found out was also that um she spent some time in Florida, which is kind of a fun aspect. And I write about that in the book. She went to Florida um after she'd been in New York for a while. And she'd already acquired an agent or a manager rather, Elliot Roberts, and an agent, and she was connecting with David Geffen, who became her agent and a great mentor. But Elliot was really the one who was her gonna like help her become a star. And but before she went there, she needed a little break. So she went down to Florida, and there she met David Crosby. And David Crosby, of course, was the producer of her first album, was an early lover of hers, a great friend, and a great collaborator. And I was lucky enough to interview Crosby for the book, also interviewed many of her other cohort during this time, Graham Nash, James Taylor, people like that. So I'm not going to read from the section that's about her time, her early time in Laurel Canyon, because we can talk about that, but I think that's probably the best known uh, part of her story. So instead, I'm going to jump a little bit ahead. As you all are probably Joni fans, you know she made several albums during those Laurel Canyon years. And she did go to Greece and spent some time there in the caves of Madala. And of course, that's famous because of her song Carrie on her album Blue. That was a that was sort of a getting away from one situation and into another. That was in her transition from her relationship with Graham Nash, which kind of frames her early fame, and her relationship with James Taylor, and the great collaboration that gave birth to Blue. But we're going to pick up the story a little bit after that. I have a very long chapter on her transition away from the folk years and into jazz fusion. And during that time, I also, of course, talk about what many people consider Joni's greatest album, if Blue is not her greatest album, which is Hejira. So Hejira is the album that she made that really marks the kind of apex of her experimentation with jazz, her occupying a space that I borrow a phrase from the musicologist Kevin Fellez, who himself borrowed it from literary theory of the broken middle. So she's like inhabiting this musical space that is between jazz and pop and folk and really defining her own space at that time. And she's having some success. She's playing with Tom Scott and the LA Express. She's also living with John Guerin, the drummer, who is the drummer in that band. And he is really serving as a kind of an amanuensis for her. Joni Mitchell never learned how to read music. So often her collaborators, they would form a bridge and help her out in the studio. So John Guerin came up with a form of annotation, and that's how she would communicate what she wanted with these players. But at a certain point, the relationship with Guerin is going south. They've been touring, the tour kind of falls apart, and she decides to take a trip. Okay, so this is called Hejira Means Pilgrimage. One sec, I'm going to have a sip of water.
Go for it.
Okay. Throughout the 1970s, Mitchell made music in defiance of pop's familiar forms of containment and stretched her lyrical approach to match. Jazz fusion's game of upending expectations inspired her to not only continue shifting her sound, but to fully erase the patina of preciousness that clung to her during her folkish years. Continuing to expand her songs beyond confession and close observation, she tried social critique, allegory, and even free association. She explored storytelling as a tool for mining the subconscious, inspired by psychoanalysis, meditation, and possibly peyote. Three journeys in the mid-1970s put her firmly back in Voyager mode. A tour cut short by her imploding relationship with John Guerin, an exhilarating, frustrating stint on Bob Dylan's circus-like Rolling Thunder Review tour, and a spontaneous road trip, at first with a couple of boys in excuse me, in tow, and then solo from LA to Maine. Sorry, gotta take some more water. Excuse me. From LA to Maine, and all the way down the East Coast and across the southern states back to California. As she drove, she continued to document her inner journeys, which sometimes got positively wild. From this flight, this work, would come a trio of studio albums offering her freest music yet, crowned by one of her greatest, Hejira. She'd found the word Hejira in the dictionary, trawling for something that evoked her desire to traverse the borders she felt were hemming her in. Arabic for pilgrimage, Wanderlust again put Mitchell squarely in the center of American popular consciousness, taking over just as mobility resurfaced as a central topic in public conversation. Social mores were loosening, even as political and economic realities grew more challenging for the very people supposedly freed by the previous era's cultural shifts. So, what I mean is, after the counterculture, the 60s counterculture, the upheavals of that era and the hope and the utopianism, things changed in the 70s. Road movies and travelogues became popular again, and a feminist version emerged, with women as the protagonists, seeking to escape men's stifling presence and find themselves. These stories reflected the hopes and struggles of women trying to seize opportunities in the workplace or their post-divorce personal lives, running into roadblocks and devising new routes. I just have to mention Chris Christopherson. Recently, we lost him, and he stars in one of the greatest of these movies, which is called Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, also starring Ellen Burstyn, directed by Martin Scorsese. As women and in aligned movements, people of color and queer people worked to erase the bounds imposed on them. The paladins of the old American dream often seemed utterly upended. On the screen, anti-heroes were in. The decade's heartthrobs ranged from scruffy street renegades like Robert De Niro and Al Pacino to nutjob Jack Nicholson and everybody's favorite unreliable date, Warren Beatty. These men had the dislocated air of sons unable to manage their inheritances, echoing the pathos of the current social climate. Everyone wanted to get somewhere or away from somewhere. Just don't stand still. The history of this period is, to steal a line from Joni, written in the white lines of the highway. But that freeway is a place of stasis as much as a conduit to change. Play it as it lays, the novel of female sadness that had so well complemented the nascent women's liberation movement, that novel by Joan Didion, and I write about it in an earlier chapter, was relevant again. This time for its portrait of unrest, as visible on LA's gleaming overpasses. In a 1973 New York Times article, Joan Didion reflected on the neurotic driving habits of her anti-heroine Maria Wyeth. She didn't have anything to do. She was kind of in a limbo, Joan explained. When you're in that state, marking time and trying to stay together, you've got to have something to do to organize your day. The freeways give you a spurious sense of organization. You do have to be organized and in control. Maria drove in circles, as Joni did sometimes, to reassemble herself. Didion's words made me think of the way the songwriter Dan Wilson describes the music of Hejira. Endless loops. Loops within loops within loops. Always moving, never landing. And I talk a little bit more about Maria Wyeth, and I say, I believe Joni Mitchell would have barely tolerated Maria Wyeth. I'm saying Maria, it's Mariah, sorry. Mariah Wyeth, if she'd been a real person and they'd ever met. She disliked weak women. As much as her own road songs similarly alight in liminal spaces, our Joan has too much vigor, too much actualized desire to give in the way that Didion's heroine does. If anything, Didion's Lady Driver recalls the characters in Mitchell songs who doom themselves by sitting still. the unnamed socialite in Hissing of Summer Lawns, who responds in despair to a busted television in her mansion. Tubes gone, darkness, darkness, no color, no contrast. Or the former poolside beauty Harry weds in Harry's house, who reeled him in only to tell him to shove his wealth and status up his ass, but who probably doesn't leave him in the end. Or the dissatisfied aging ingenue in Shades of Scarlet Conquering, tied up by her conviction that a woman must have everything, but only men can fulfill that demand. Even the title's character in Song for Sharon, a real friend whom Joni loved, gains only faint praise for remaining on her farm, making meals and singing to a crowd only the size of her nuclear family, while Joni remains on the road, heading out of the Los Angeles chaparral towards something green. There was so much more on offer in the 1970s for women who might be thinking a trip could be nice. Take your pick from the top of the bestseller list or the bottom shelves of the feminist bookstore, from Saturday night matinee offerings and jukebox hits. Women on the move were everywhere. Some authors behind the era's travelogue boom were on Mitchell's radar. Her fellow LA babe, Eve Babbitt's, the Canadian Margaret Atwood. Others she likely didn't know, like Black science fiction trailblazer Octavia Butler. But they all shared a spirit, an insistence that the guys who claimed those freeway lines stop hogging the road. Bob Dylan released his own road record, Desire, in 1976, brimming with swashbuckling ballads about romance and quests for treasure in exotic locales. Oh, I should mention that Dylan is sort of, and we can talk about this, Dylan is sort of a doppelganger and he's just a character throughout this book. Compared to Dylan's heroics, Mitchell often wrote of her journeys in an almost pedestrian way. He bragged about mystical outlaw princesses that drew him into catacombs and gunfights. She focused on hotel room trysts and the bitter coffee sheepish lovers drank in diners the next morning. She did see visions, heavenly hexagrams formed by jet planes, but she also noticed the antique dolls in the bed and breakfast where she spent the night. This was a gift that women's travel stories offered, not a shortcoming. Within the heterosexual cliche, a traveling man can leap into the realm of fantasy, while a woman often ends up cleaning up the mess that adventurer made, especially if she made it with him. Think of Rayette, the wishful, pregnant waitress played by Karen Black, whom Jack Nicholson's Bobby abandons at a rural gas station at the end of Five Easy Pieces. Director Bob Raffleson's film leaves her stranded, pathetic. The songs and stories many women wrote in the 1970s take up right after this moment, showing the dirty diapers and the temporary jobs that fill a woman's life as she tries to locate her own power outside the typical hero's tale. The singer-songwriter Maggie Roach, who like Joni became a single mother at 20 and entrusted her son in adoption, succinctly expressed how responsibility landed on such women adventurers when their men wandered off. The world is handout on the corners, and the burden of proof is on you. Some women singer-songwriters focus on some messes and the costs and comforts of sticking around to manage it. A profile of Carly Simon stressed her homebody side. She confesses she doesn't like to travel, the piece reads. Among other things, I am paranoid about eating out of town tuna fish sandwiches, she said. Simon made a neat 1970s career of critiquing the domestic life she and James Taylor imperfectly modeled. He continued to struggle with heroin as they became parents to two, eventually divorcing in 1983. Hits like We Have No Secrets and Haven't Got Time for the Pain expose the imperfections of the swinging while married upper middle class. Her image as a mommy sexpot tended to overshadow Simon's incisive side. In the late 1970s, her ode to women's slow-building orgasm, Anticipation, was repurposed into an iconic Heinz ketchup commercial that deflected the song's sensuality into the hungry hands of children. Family fare at its latchkey kid best. Mitchell, meanwhile, sought a broken middle again, this time between the masculine and the feminine. Her songs conveyed the conflict she and many women felt between the desire to escape old roles and the awareness that there were no real role models for maintaining safety and security within a self-determined life. Again and again, the same situation. She allegedly wrote that line from Court and Spark about Warren Beatty, an unusual flirtation for her, an actor and notorious Lothario. The situation was this: she wanted to be in love, which for her also meant making a home, but only if she could also leave that nest when inspiration, and as she called it, my struggle for higher achievements, demanded. Doing both sometimes seemed to require that she bend time and collapse space. Um, okay, I have a couple more pages, so should I just finish the section? I guess I will.
Sure.
I see our crowd has dwindled, but that's
Yeah,
okay.
that's okay.
Many women's travelogues in the 1970s teetered on this lunch plate's edge between the quest for liberation and the realities many women couldn't leave behind. Kids, partners, homes, communities. Faith, the middle-aged heroine of Grace Paley's 1974 short story, The Long Distance Runner, takes up the sport to allay domestic emptiness as her children age out of their teens. In a surreal twist, she temporarily holds up with the Black family who has moved into her Bronx childhood home. But she soon returns to her son's an unreliable boyfriend. Joan Foster, the romance novel writing heroine of Margaret Atwood's 1976 Lady Oracle, lives a lifetime of escapes from adolescent obesity into svelte adulthood, into marriage and then out of it, in affairs and through the Gothic romances she authors, until her various alternate realities become so jumbled that she fakes her own death to elude them. She too seems destined to return to home and husband after her ruse is uncovered, although she may have a new lover in tow. Even Isadora Wing, the emblematic libertine in Erica Jong's Fear of Flying, tries many positions with a few different men, but ends up back with husband Bennett after a sexual assault convinces her that the zipless fuck she's seeking is meaningless without emotional connection. Jong's phrase became a catchword for liberation, but women's road stories rarely, if ever, idealize the anonymous encounters it signifies. In them, freedom came through better connections with men, or sometimes women, and through greater self awareness, not full abandonment of traditional couplings' intimate bonds. This pattern of breakaways and returns was one that many people, especially women, understood. New horizons could be reached creatively and spiritually, but love and marriage in particular often put the vehicle back in park. Some writers turned to science fiction as a way out of this plot limitation. For Atwood, Marge Piercy, and Octavia Butler, time and space travel allowed women freedom that seemed unimaginable otherwise. Some of its spirit enters into Mitchell's mid-1970s songwriting, as her metaphors soar. The eagle and the serpent are at war in me, she sings in the title track from 1977's Don Juan's Reckless Daughter. Scales to feathers, crawl and fly. Compare this to the scene she painted in the same situation of herself contained within Warren Beatty's mirrored bathroom, primping and questioning her urge to do so. The timid, pretty girl has become an airborne gorgon, her internal struggles mythologized. All right, I think I'll stop there. So thank you for listening. And I see a few people are left. I can answer some questions if you like.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was really lovely. Can
Thank
you
you.
tell us so that that trip to Damariscotta, did she choose that location like for any particular reason? And did she talk about like what she found there or what what she was
Uh,
looking for there
uh,
anywhere?
Well, I hate to disappoint you, but there's actually no record of
Oh,
that
really?
really, very little that I've found.
Hmm.
She was traveling with two men, one one there may be a record, but I didn't find much on it. There's so she had a lover, a brief lover from Australia who came to
Hmm.
Los Angeles, and she kind of hooked up with him again, and a man that I know very little about, who was a friend of his, I think, All we know about him is that she met him at a bonfire and he was a flight attendant. So they are that's the trio that made it their
Hmm.
way to Maine.
Okay.
And then after that, she parts ways with them. And that's when she goes down the coast
Hmm.
and ventures into the South
Mm.
and ends up driving through Alabama, which there is some records of that, and Texas. And when she writes Amelia, she's in the Southwest for sure. So yeah.
So
Uh,
she really made her way across all parts of the country.
yes, and for an artist like a single woman, even one with as much self-assurance and confidence as Joni, that was a daring thing, very
Sure.
daring thing to do in the mid 70s. And as a woman who also was famous, but
Hmm.
she disguised herself. Well, I don't know if how much she disguised herself, but she used pseudonyms. There's an interesting account I found from some time she spent in Alabama where she signed into a hotel under the name Joan Black, and then proceeded to hang out in the bar and meet some people, and then go back to their house and play music all night. So, she wasn't averse to being discovered, but she did want to have this experience
Like
that.
fly below the radar a bit.
Yeah,
She could,
exactly.
yeah.
I think, Joni Mitchell's had a very contentious relationship with her own fame throughout her life.
Hmm.
And, whether she's retreated early on, when she made For the Roses, she retreated, not that early on, but when she made For the Roses, she retreated back into her life in Canada and kind of lived this monastic existence. And, she has this road period. And then, later she became something of a recluse, and now of course she's
Hmm.
back. So
Nice. So, folks in the audience, just a couple things they've shared or have been asking.
yeah.
You suggested maybe she started traveling with a ukulele.
Yeah.
And someone has suggested maybe it was a dulcimer because those are such a portable
I,
instrument.
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. She did play dulcimer on Blue, and there's an amazing dulcimer maker named Joanne Lepidus who made that dulcimer. Um, and she lives in California, Big Sur area. But no, Joni's first instrument was a ukulele. She wanted to buy a guitar, but her mom, you know, maybe didn't take her seriously,
Hmm.
bought her a ukulele. That was actually a very common first instrument for a lot of people
Oh,
in
okay.
that era. It was very portable, easy to play. There's been a little bit of a revival, and I had a
I
section
know
in
for a
this
long
book.
time, like local libraries, like you could borrow them,
Yeah,
from the library. Yeah, they had a big
exactly,
resurgence.
exactly.
Hmm.
And the ukulele has a really interesting history in the US. There's the connection with Hawaii, which now there's some evidence. And actually Kevin Velez, who I mentioned, who's a musicologist, he has a book. Well, he's written a book on Hawaiian slack key guitar, but he's a great writer if you're interested in the connection between Hawaii and the US. And I know it's a long way from Maine, but but the ukulele, of course, there's evidence is turning up that there were Hawaiian musicians who were playing as early on as like the very early 20th century, and not only the slacky guitar, which Velez writes about, which really influenced blues players,
Hmm.
but the ukulele as well. For example, there's going to be a novel coming out next year by the musician Paul Birch, and it's the life of Jimmie Rodgers, the country great, the very early country musician, um, and talks about how he had a Hawaiian guy in his band. So, this is an interesting thing. So the ukulele came over from Hawaii. It was like bohemians were playing it in the 20s. You find
Hmm.
accounts of this. It became a very common instrument for children, which people might know, but also for teenagers. And then that's where its place was in the folk revival. Um, Joni switched to a little Spanish travel size guitar after the
Hmm.
ukulele, and then eventually to a guitar, full size guitar. But dulcimer is very important
Hmm.
in her story because it's the main instrument on Blue. So yeah, it's a great call to mention that instrument, very important instrument.
Someone else is asking, were you able to connect with Joni when you were about writing the book? Do you know her thoughts?
Uh,
Yeah.
well, I do talk in the book about the two times I met Joni. one time was long before I wrote this book, and then the other was during the process. Brandy Carlisle introduced me to her, and I chose to not interview her for this because I wanted to have once. Okay, so particularly for Joni Mitchell, but for many celebrities, there's a authorized biography, and then there's like an
Mm.
unauthorized biography, and once you're kind of in, I was going to use the phrase in bed. That's improper, but
So like in authorized territory.
yeah, in
Yeah.
authorized territory, and once you're in there, and it kind of changes. It can change your
Sure.
motivations, I think.
Hmm.
It can make it more difficult to say difficult things. And I wanted to have that freedom and that distance. But she didn't know about the book. I have not yet heard directly from her, but I know Brandy is a big fan of it, so that makes me happy.
Nice.
Um, and there's some indication she might have looked at it, but I'm not absolutely sure.
Now, can you tell us anything? This next book sounds really interesting too about revolutionary women musicians. What can you tell us
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, well, I would love it if folks would check out this book. It's called How Women Made Music: A Revolutionary History. It's derived from a series that began in 2017, around the same time I was first working on this book. Actually, I was working on the book before, but the series is called Turning the Tables, and you can find much of the material online at NPR Music. But the book actually, so the series, the idea was three me and two friends of mine and I, we were in New Orleans at this festival, and the great left-handed electric guitarist Barbara Lynn was playing a set. It was a kind of a garage rock and underground soul festival.
Hmm.
And Barbara Lynn is a black woman who had some hits in the 60s and was a very innovative guitarist. And we kind of turned to each other, these two girlfriends of mine and I, and said, like, why does nobody ever talk about her? Why is she never on the list
Sure.
where
Hmm.
Eric Clapton and
Right,
Amy
right.
Malmsteen and whoever? And that led us to say, well, why are women so marginalized on these lists and in histories? And yes, Joni's always present, but she's never at the top. Well, now
Hmm.
this was in 2017, so at the time, she's never going to be topping Dylan and Hendrix or whoever and
Hmm.
Beatles. So the first thing we did was made a list of the 150 greatest albums by women of the album era, which we call 1964 to 2016. And there are some
Hmm.
arbitrary reasons for choosing those dates, but we're kind of dating it beginning with when the Beatles made Revolver and Rubber Soul. And then we ended it with Beyonce's Lemonade because, well, we had to include that. So that was our first project. And then that went viral, did really great. So then we did the 200 greatest songs by women of the 21st century. We wanted to sort of make history in real time. Then we went back and did a series on 8 women who invented popular music, and that included Maybelle Carter and Bessie Smith and Marian Anderson, the great operatic diva, and Mary Lou Williams, the great jazz composer. So we had a series of essays a week for each of those writers, or sorry, musicians. And then we did some more seasons after that. All of that material is sort of sifted through and compiled into this book by Allison Fensterstock, edited by Allison Fensterstock. I wrote the introduction, and also one thing that people are loving about it is that it also includes excerpts from 50 plus years of interviews with artists, women artists, by NPR journalists and hosts.
Nice.
So everyone from, Nina Simone to Madonna to Julian Baker, I think is in there, like it really is quite extensive and beautifully illustrated. The cover is by Nicole Rifkin, who does a lot of New Yorker covers. It's got cartoons in it. It's just a really fun, wonderful book. I was trying to put the cover in the chat, but I don't think I can do that. But yeah, thanks for asking about it.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. And folks can buy their copy of Traveling from MHS. I shared that link in the chat, Traveling on the Path of Joni Mitchell. And thank you so much, Anne, for sharing with us some excerpts from that book tonight and your expertise. Um, We really appreciate you being here.
No, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
It was our pleasure, and safe travels to you as you kind of make your way around the country too.
Thanks so much. Bye.